disease. Your DNA can reveal parental linkages, who your parents are or who are not your parents. Ancestral identity, that is, what region of the world your ancestors came from, whether they came from Africa or Asia or Northern Europe. They can reveal sibling connections between brothers and sisters and familial disease patterns, such as if there is a particular mutation that appears in your family. The DNA can sometimes reveal environmental and drug sensitivities, and we're learning more about that. They can also reveal your identity. So if you've been somewhere and somebody has your DNA, they can reveal whether you were at that particular site if they use your DNA as an identification program. What does our forensic DNA profile reveal? The 13 pairs of numbers thus far only reveals our identity. The particular sites chosen are not known to reveal any physical or medical properties of the individual. But the biological sample that is obtained to get our profile is usually retained by the police department. So the police department has the most intimate information we can imagine, namely the information that's on our genome, which could reveal all of those things I mentioned before: disease states, predispositions, familial disease patterns, etc. Now, medical genetics have a lot of privacy rules, and there is almost near unanimity that an individual's medical genetic information is a private matter. Many states have passed legislation that protects people from the unauthorized use of medical genetic information. And the federal government, in a few years ago, passed the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. This means that an employer or someone who is providing health insurance cannot use your genetic information to discriminate against you, to prevent you from getting a job, or to charge you more health insurance than anyone else. So the federal government has understood the need to protect us from genetic information. And these laws are tied to an anti-genetic discrimination goals. For example, the Federal Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, often called GINA, prohibits access to individual genetic information by insurance companies, prohibits insurance companies from requesting that applicants be genetically tested, and prohibits employers from genetically testing prospective employees. James Watson was one of the two scientists who discovered the structure of DNA in 1953. And he is, of course, emblazoned in the history of science. At age 79, Watson donated his DNA to be sequenced at a cost of about $1 million. However, he expressed an expectation of privacy regarding a segment of his genetic code. Part of that code reveals information about whether or not he has a predisposition to Alzheimer's disease. One of his grandmothers died of Alzheimer's at the age of 84. And he figures he has maybe one of 4 chances, and he doesn't want to know. And he doesn't want anybody else to know. And this is just an example of how people feel about certain privacy aspects of what's on their DNA or on their genome. This chart that I have on the screen shows how much more information we have about diseases which are known, genetic diseases which are now being tested. There's over 1,200 diseases that we can now test on a person's DNA. And the question is whether or not you or somebody else has an interest in that information. So you have people, of course, who strongly oppose others getting their hands on their DNA because the information has such importance and such intimate value to you. So to what extent does privacy enter into forensic uses of DNA? The courts have upheld the Fourth Amendment privacy rights in relationship to the degree of intrusion. Our bodies, our home, our auto, entering a phone booth with an expectation of privacy, thermal imaging of a home. These are considered intrusions in our privacy when there is no warrant, without a warrant. So would it be an intrusion if somebody looks into our DNA without a warrant? That's a big question. And the courts have not totally resolved that question. Courts have resolved the question of whether or not a policeman without a warrant can demand your DNA. And the answer is no, that's intrusive. Now they can get a warrant to do it, but that means that they have to go to a judge for the court to make that decision. To the extent, of course, the conditions for a reasonable expectation of privacy in other areas have to do with the extent to which the DNA is exposed to the public. If something is exposed to the public, generally the courts have said you don't have an expectation of privacy. If you open your window shades and people walk by and they see something in your home, then you really don't have an expectation of privacy. Another condition is the extent of bodily intrusion in obtaining something from you, like a DNA sample. It is intrusive to obtain a DNA sample, but not as intrusive as it used to be. It used to be pretty intrusive because they had to stick a needle in your arm and get a blood sample. Now they can just put a swab in your cheek and just get some of your saliva, which is not as intrusive as a needle in your arm. But still, under the Fourth Amendment, we are protected from someone doing that without a court warrant. When suspicion is low and intrusiveness is high, the Fourth Amendment protection is generally high. In contrast, as suspicion grows and intrusiveness diminishes, then the protection against the invasion of privacy by law enforcement weakens. So law enforcement agents can get a court order for forced blood samples, but they can't do it without a court order. And as DNA identification no longer requires a blood sample, but rather a cheek swab, intrusiveness has dropped precipitously, and so too has Fourth Amendment protection. So I can show you this chart here, which basically illustrates that as the intrusiveness gets higher and the suspicion lower, then the Fourth Amendment protection is much greater. But as the intrusiveness is low and the suspicion is high, then the Fourth Amendment protection is very low. So if a policeman sees somebody suspicious, looks like he might have committed a crime, then he has a right to ask that person to empty his pockets or to take further conditions in terms of gathering information from that individual. You can also see that individuals are given higher or lower protection depending upon what their relationship is with the courts. Somebody who is incarcerated has very low privacy protections. On the other hand, somebody way up at the top, a suspicionless individual, has very high Fourth Amendment protections. And of course, this changes if the state has special needs or if there's a certain balancing. For example, somebody who is an engineer on a train, who is driving a train, does not have protections against privacy when they want to do a sample of his urine to find out if he's taking drugs. And that has to do with the protection of society. So who gets their DNA on the federal database called CODIS? The term DNA creep is the expression for the widening of criteria for including DNA samples on national databanks. Person convicted for felonies will get their DNA for sure on the database. Person charged with felonies may or may not. Usually their DNA will be taken. Increasingly, however, DNA creep means that people who are arrested or detained for felonies, picked up for misdemeanors, entering the country, these people will get their DNA on databanks in certain states where they have passed laws that have opened up the process of putting people's DNA on the national databank. And of course, somebody can just follow you around and find a cup of yours and have your DNA profiled and do anything they want with it. As a matter of fact, this article appeared in the New York Times called "The DNA Age: Stalking Strangers." And apparently there's no law against somebody stalking you, finding your DNA and profiling it and doing what they wish with it. Here's a little cartoon talking about somebody who gave up their DNA and found out that perhaps they weren't the father of the baby. In England, they have perhaps the most aggressive DNA data banking system in the world. They'll take the DNA of anyone over 10 years old and they will put it on a data bank. And even if somebody is innocent, they will not take the DNA off the data bank. They'll keep it on, and they have the largest percentage of their population in the world on a DNA data bank. In England, one of the chairperson of the Human Genetics Commission commented on that. Until now, there has been nothing to stop an unscrupulous person, perhaps a journalist or a private investigator, from secretly taking an everyday object used by a public figure like a coffee mug or a toothbrush with the express purpose of having the person's DNA analyzed. The British were the first country in the world to prevent non-police from taking somebody's DNA and analyzing it. One can suspect that they might have been trying to protect the royal family from having their DNA profiled on one of the daily newspapers, or protecting a government official, perhaps, from having his or her DNA profiled, maybe with some sequence that might be embarrassing. Maybe there's a sequence that they might get Alzheimer's disease one day. So in this book, Genetic Justice, we have proposed a set of axioms that we feel are important to protect people against the privacy interests of for the privacy interests of their DNA and against unscrupulous uses of their DNA. We feel, axiom 1, the DNA genomic information that we have is analogous to medical records in that it contains highly intimate and personal information about an individual's disease predisposition, genetic abnormalities, paternity, and immunological sensitivity. The privacy of medical records in hospitals, including genetic screening, is comparable to privacy of DNA analysis disclosing anything other than identity that has no phenotypic or genetic implications. In other words, using the DNA for our identity is one thing, but in the United States, the police hold on to the biological sample that contains all the other information other than identity. And that's the problem with intruding into our privacy. Another axiom, axiom 2, all materials, including DNA, at a crime scene are open to forensic investigation without warrants that will help police determine the identity of the victim and perpetrator. There is no expectation of privacy associated with what a person or persons have left at a crime scene. So we're not saying that